It was a bright Monday morning at the bustling airport terminal, the hum of conversations and the faint announcements over the speakers filling the air. People hurried through security lines, clutched boarding passes, and scanned screens for gate numbers. Among the sea of travelers was Claire, a well-dressed woman in her mid-40s, with a designer handbag slung over her shoulder and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She stood by the boarding gate, scrolling through her phone, clearly impatient as she sighed loudly at the delay announcement. A few feet away, Marcus, a young black man in his late 20s, quietly adjusted the strap of his backpack. He was dressed casually but neatly, his warm smile revealing a calm, approachable demeanor. Marcus had just returned from a business trip, and while he was tired, he felt a sense of accomplishment. Today's flight was just another routine leg of his journey home, until it wasn't. As passengers were called to board, the queue began forming. Claire was one of the first to march towards the gate, her sharp heels clicking on the polished floor. Behind her was Marcus, who noticed the slight glance she threw his way before immediately looking forward again, her posture stiffening as if she were suddenly uncomfortable. He didn't think much of it, perhaps she was just in a hurry. Boarding the plane, Claire was visibly displeased when she realized her seat was in the middle row. She had hoped for something more spacious, perhaps an aisle seat, but she begrudgingly tucked her handbag under the seat in front of her and settled in. Moments later, Marcus walked down the aisle, glancing at his ticket before stopping beside her row. "Excuse me," he said politely, pointing to the window seat. "I think that's my seat." Claire looked up, her expression quickly shifting to one of disdain. She hesitated for a moment, as though considering her options, before standing up stiffly to let him through. As Marcus slid into his seat, he offered a friendly nod and a quick "thanks," but Claire barely acknowledged him. Instead, she sat down with an exaggerated sigh and immediately reached for her in-flight magazine, holding it as if it were a shield. The plane began filling up, and the usual chaos of passengers stowing luggage and finding seats ensued. Claire couldn't help but glance at Marcus out of the corner of her eye, her lips pressed tightly together. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, making it a point to lean slightly away from him. Marcus noticed but chose to ignore her. He put on his headphones and opened his laptop, ready to catch up on some work. As the plane taxied to the runway, Claire's discomfort seemed to grow. She pressed the call button for the flight attendant, and when the young woman arrived, Claire leaned in and whispered something. The attendant's polite smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and walked away. Marcus, still focused on his screen, didn't notice the exchange. Moments later, the flight attendant returned with another crew member. Claire spoke in a hushed but firm tone, gesturing discreetly towards Marcus. The second attendant listened carefully, her expression growing increasingly serious. Marcus finally sensed the tension and took off his headphones, looking at the attendants curiously. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but puzzled. Before the attendants could respond, Claire interjected. "I don't think the seating arrangement is appropriate," she said, her tone clipped. "I prefer to be moved." The attendants exchanged a glance, unsure of how to proceed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," one of them said gently. "The flight is fully booked. We can't change your seat at this time." Claire's face flushed with frustration. "This is unacceptable," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. "I should not have to sit here." Marcus frowned, realizing what was happening. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Ma'am, if there's a problem, I'd appreciate it if you addressed it directly with me," he said evenly. Claire shot him a cold look. "I shouldn't have to explain myself," she snapped. The murmurs around them grew louder as passengers began to piece together the situation. Some whispered to each other, while others openly stared, waiting to see how it would unfold. The attendants tried to de-escalate the situation, urging Claire to take her seat and assuring her that everything was fine. But Claire was relentless. "I demand to speak with the captain," she declared, her voice rising. "This is not about him personally. It's about my right to feel comfortable." Marcus closed his laptop, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't new to this kind of prejudice, but it never got easier. Meanwhile, the flight crew huddled together at the front of the plane, speaking in hushed tones. As tension filled the cabin, a passenger seated across the aisle finally spoke up. "Ma'am, you're making a scene," the man said, shaking his head. "Why don't you just sit down and let everyone get on with their day?" Claire glared at him but said nothing, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. She crossed her arms and sank back into her seat, fuming. The flight attendants returned, their expressions firm but professional. "Ma'am," one of them said, "if you continue to disrupt the flight, we'll have no choice but to involve airport security." Claire looked stunned. "Security? Are you serious?" The attendant nodded. "We take the comfort and safety of all our passengers seriously, and your behavior is causing unnecessary distress." Marcus glanced out the window, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him, let alone the flight crew and a fellow passenger. But the situation was far from over, and as the attendants prepared to address the issue further, the plane's engines roared to life. What happened next left everyone on board speechless. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the atmosphere remained thick with unease. Claire sat stiffly, her arms crossed, as if withdrawing into her own indignation. Marcus, on the other hand, tried to focus on the window, letting his eyes trace the patterns of light on the tarmac below. But he couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't the first time he faced someone like Claire, and sadly, he doubted it would be the last. Still, the open hostility stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. He felt the eyes of other passengers on him, some sympathetic, others curious, but most trying not to stare too openly. The flight attendants returned to their positions, though one of them lingered a little longer, watching Claire cautiously. As the plane began its ascent, the tension seemed to settle slightly, but it was clear that the situation wasn't over. Claire's rigid posture and occasional glances at Marcus made her displeasure obvious. She wasn't the type to let things go quietly. Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to breathe deeply and keep his mind occupied. He thought about his mother, who always encouraged him to take the high road in situations like this. "People's ignorance says more about them than it ever will about you," she used to tell him. But even as her words echoed in his mind, Marcus felt the familiar frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He had worked hard to build his career, to prove himself in a world that often judged him unfairly. Why did moments like this still have to happen? Meanwhile, Claire's thoughts raced. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public. She told herself that she had every right to feel the way she did, that her discomfort was justified. But deep down, a small part of her wondered if she had gone too far. The glances from other passengers weren't lost on her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a twinge of self-consciousness. Yet, her pride wouldn't allow her to admit she might be wrong. Instead, she doubled down on her resolve, her fingers gripping the armrests tightly. As the plane leveled out, the flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, paused at Marcus's row. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked softly, her tone warmer than it had been with other passengers. Marcus smiled faintly, appreciating her subtle effort to show kindness. "Just water, please," he replied. The attendant nodded, quickly fetching a bottle of water and placing it on his tray table. As she moved on, Claire shifted uncomfortably, her disapproval evident. Marcus chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of the engines and the faint chatter around the cabin. Nearby, a young girl seated with her mother leaned over and whispered something, her eyes wide as she glanced at Marcus and Claire. The mother hushed her gently, offering an apologetic smile when Marcus caught her gaze. He nodded politely, though the exchange left him feeling even more exposed. Time seemed to drag as the flight continued. Claire's irritation began to manifest in small, passive-aggressive ways. She made a point of keeping her elbows firmly on the armrest they shared, occasionally bumping Marcus's arm as if to assert her dominance over the space. Each time, Marcus simply adjusted his position, refusing to give her the satisfaction of reacting. But the final straw came when Claire, frustrated by Marcus's calm demeanor, pressed the call button once more. The same flight attendant appeared, her expression carefully neutral. "How can I assist you, ma'am?" Claire leaned in, her voice low but insistent. "I still don't feel comfortable sitting here," she said. "Surely there's a solution." The attendant hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining professionalism and addressing the growing tension. Before she could respond, another passenger, a middle-aged woman seated a row ahead, turned around. "Maybe the solution is for you to adjust your attitude," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. The words hung in the air, followed by a ripple of murmurs from other passengers. Claire's face flushed crimson, and for a moment, she was at a loss for words. Marcus looked away, both surprised and slightly embarrassed by the stranger's intervention. He wasn't sure if it made things better or worse. The flight attendant, sensing the need to de-escalate, stepped in. "Ma'am," she said to Claire, "if you have any further concerns, I'd be happy to discuss them with you privately after we land. For now, I kindly ask for your cooperation." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sank back into her seat, her embarrassment now competing with her anger. The other passenger, satisfied with her input, turned back around, shaking her head slightly. Marcus took another deep breath, trying to focus on the view outside. The clouds stretched endlessly across the horizon, a reminder of how small these moments could feel in the grand scheme of things. But despite his efforts to rise above it, the encounter had left a mark. He couldn't help but wonder what Claire's story was, what had made her so closed off, so quick to judge someone based on nothing more than the color of their skin. As the flight continued, Marcus's thoughts drifted to his childhood. Growing up, his parents had always emphasized the importance of education and resilience. They had faced their own battles with prejudice, but they never let it define them. His father used to say, "Son, the world's going to see you as a black man before it sees anything else. But what you show them after that is entirely up to you." Those words had carried Marcus through many difficult moments, and he clung to them now. Claire, on the other hand, was lost in her own world of rationalizations. She thought about her upbringing, about the subtle but persistent messages she'd received about people who looked like Marcus. Her parents had never been openly hateful, but there were always unspoken rules, quiet judgments passed around the dinner table. She told herself she wasn't racist. She had black coworkers, even a distant cousin who had married into a biracial family. But sitting here now, faced with her own discomfort, Claire couldn't ignore the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as open-minded as she liked to believe. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone out of their thoughts. Claire gripped the armrest tightly, her breath quickening. Marcus glanced at her, noticing the tension in her posture. "It's just a little turbulence," he said gently, his tone reassuring. Claire didn't respond, but her grip on the armrests loosened slightly. For a brief moment, the animosity between them seemed to fade, replaced by the shared vulnerability of being thousands of feet in the air. As the turbulence passed and the plane steadied, the flight attendants resumed their rounds. One of them approached Claire with a quiet word, likely a reminder about remaining seated and following the rules. Claire nodded curtly, her earlier defiance replaced by a sullen silence. Marcus, meanwhile, closed his eyes and leaned back, willing himself to find some peace in the midst of the chaos. But he knew the situation wasn't over, not for Claire, and certainly not for him. What lay ahead, once the plane landed, remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: this flight had become far more than just a journey from one city to another. It was now a collision of two worlds, each forcing the other to confront truths they might not be ready to face. As the hours stretched on, the plane hummed steadily through the clouds, but the tension between Claire and Marcus refused to dissipate. Claire's eyes darted occasionally toward Marcus, as if trying to read him, while Marcus focused on the view outside or the pages of a book he had pulled from his bag. The silence between them felt louder than any conversation could have been, a quiet battlefield of unspoken words and unresolved conflict. A flight attendant passed by, offering snacks to passengers. Marcus accepted a small packet of pretzels with a polite smile. When she turned to Claire, the older woman waved her off with a curt, "I'm fine." But it was clear she wasn't fine at all. Her rigid posture and tightly crossed arms spoke volumes about her discomfort. though whether it stemmed from her seating arrangement or the judgment of those around her was unclear. Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman who had earlier confronted Claire kept stealing glances their way. Her husband leaned over to whisper something, and she nodded in response, her expression firm. She wasn't the only one watching. Other passengers occasionally cast quick looks toward the pair, their curiosity and unease evident. Marcus felt their eyes but refused to let them affect him. He had learned long ago how to endure being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. In an effort to distract himself, Marcus thought about his meeting earlier that week. It had gone well, better than he'd expected. His pitch for a new client account had been met with enthusiasm, and he was optimistic about the deal closing soon. But now, the memory of that success felt distant, overshadowed by the weight of the present moment. He glanced at the watch on his wrist, noting how much longer the flight had to go. Too long, he thought. Claire shifted in her seat, her discomfort growing by the minute. She fumbled with her handbag, pulling out a tablet and tapping aimlessly at the screen. She opened an article but barely read a word. Her mind was a swirl of justifications and doubts. Why was she letting this get to her? Why couldn't she just let it go? Yet every time she tried to rationalize her actions, the memory of that other passenger's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk maybe the solution is for you to adjust your attitude asterisk. The phrase gnawed at her. She replayed the moment over and over, each time feeling a mix of anger and shame. What did that woman know about her life, about her experiences? Claire told herself she wasn't the villain in this story. She was just a woman who had been caught off guard, made uncomfortable, and had reacted. But deep down, the cracks in her reasoning were beginning to show. The plane jolted again, not as harshly as before, but enough to make a child in the back cry out. Claire gripped the armrest, her breath catching. Without thinking, she glanced at Marcus, who noticed her anxiety but said nothing this time. He simply returned to his book, his calm presence both reassuring and frustrating to Claire. She hated how composed he seemed, how unaffected he appeared to be by everything that had happened. It made her feel smaller, more petty. The hours dragged on, and the cabin lights dimmed as the flight entered its final stretch. Many passengers had dozed off, the hum of the engines a steady lullaby. Marcus closed his book and leaned back, his eyes shut, though sleep didn't come easily. His mind wandered to his younger sister, who had always teased him for being too patient, too willing to see the good in people. "You give folks too much credit," she'd said more than once. But Marcus had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. It was what his parents had taught him, what his mentors had reinforced. Yet now, sitting next to Claire, he wondered if his patience was misplaced. Could someone like her ever change? Claire, meanwhile, stared blankly at the darkened screen of her tablet, the glow from the overhead light casting shadows across her face. Her thoughts drifted back to her late husband, Paul. He'd been her rock, her steady anchor in a world that often felt chaotic. Paul had been the one to challenge her, to question her assumptions and push her to see things differently. She could almost hear his voice now, urging her to think about her actions, to consider what they said about her. "You can't always be right, Claire," he used to say with a chuckle. "Sometimes it's okay to admit you're wrong." The memory brought a lump to her throat, but she pushed it down, unwilling to confront the emotions bubbling to the surface. The quiet was interrupted by the crackle of the intercom. The captain's voice came through, announcing that they would begin their descent shortly. The announcement brought a wave of relief to many passengers, eager to stretch their legs and leave the cramped cabin behind. But for Claire and Marcus, the end of the flight felt less like a resolution and more like an impending reckoning. As the plane began its descent, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting trash and ensuring everyone was buckled in. The attendant who had mediated earlier stopped briefly by Claire's row, her gaze flickering between the two passengers. "Is everything okay here?" she asked softly, her tone neutral but cautious. Claire hesitated, her pride warring with the small voice in her head telling her to apologize. "It's fine," she said curtly, her tone dismissive. Marcus nodded politely, choosing not to engage further. He was tired of the situation, tired of the tension, and tired of always being the one expected to rise above. He just wanted to get off the plane and leave this experience behind. The plane landed with a slight bump, and as it taxied to the gate, the cabin buzzed with the sounds of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Claire reached for her handbag, her movements stiff and deliberate. Marcus waited patiently, letting others pass before standing to retrieve his backpack from the overhead compartment. As they shuffled toward the exit, Claire found herself directly behind Marcus in the narrow aisle. She noticed how he carried himself, his shoulders squared but his demeanor calm. There was no trace of anger or bitterness in his expression, only quiet resolve. It made her feel inexplicably small. When they reached the door, a flight attendant bid them farewell with a warm smile. Marcus nodded in return, his polite thank you echoing as he stepped onto the jet bridge. Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second before following, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. The airport was bustling, a stark contrast to the stillness of the flight. Marcus walked purposefully toward baggage claim, his focus on the next step of his journey. Claire lingered near the gate, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear into the crowd. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt the weight of her actions in a way she couldn't ignore. She wasn't sure what she was going to do next. But one thing was clear, this encounter wasn't something she could simply forget. The question was, did she have the courage to face it? Marcus moved steadily through the crowded terminal, his focus on getting to the baggage claim as quickly as possible. He wanted to put the entire ordeal behind him, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Claire wasn't over. His shoulders were tense as he weaved through the throngs of travelers, the bright fluorescent lights of the airport doing little to ease the weight on his mind. Claire lingered behind, her pace slower as she tried to process the emotions swirling within her. She clutched her handbag tightly, as if it could anchor her to the present moment. But the truth was, she felt adrift. The confrontation on the plane had peeled back layers she wasn't ready to face, leaving her exposed to questions she'd spent years avoiding. She wanted to brush it off, to go back to the comfort of her routines and her carefully constructed beliefs. Yet, something about Marcus's calm, his refusal to be drawn into her anger, stayed with her. It was unsettling, like a mirror she wasn't prepared to look into. As Claire stepped onto the escalator leading to the baggage claim, she caught a glimpse of Marcus below. He stood near one of the conveyor belts, his tall frame easy to spot among the crowd. She watched as he adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder, his movements deliberate and composed. For a brief moment, she thought about approaching him. She wasn't sure what she would say, an apology, perhaps, though even forming the thought felt foreign to her. But the idea of admitting she was wrong made her stomach twist. The carousel buzzed to life, and Marcus stepped forward to grab his luggage. He checked the tag quickly before pulling the bag to his side, his focus now on finding a ride to his hotel. Just as he turned to leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Startled, he spun around to see a uniformed officer standing behind him. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Could you step aside for a moment? We need to ask you a few questions." Marcus's heart sank. His mind raced as he tried to think of what this could be about. He hadn't done anything wrong, of that he was certain. Yet years of experience told him that certainty didn't always matter. He glanced around, noticing the curious stares of nearby passengers. The familiar mix of embarrassment and frustration crept in, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Of course," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He followed the officer a few steps away from the carousel, his luggage trailing behind him. Meanwhile, Claire had reached the baggage claim area and witnessed the interaction from a distance. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw Marcus being questioned. For reasons she couldn't fully articulate, the sight filled her with unease. She thought about their encounter on the plane, about the way she'd insisted on involving the flight attendant. Had she inadvertently set this in motion? The officer asked Marcus for his identification, and he handed it over without hesitation. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral. "We received a report of a disturbance on the flight," the officer explained. "We're just following up to ensure everything is in order." Marcus blinked, his mind flashing back to the tense moments in the cabin. He realized what must have happened. and a wave of frustration swept over him. He had been nothing but cooperative during the entire ordeal, yet here he was, being singled out yet again. He clenched his jaw but remained composed. "I understand," he said simply. From a few feet away, Claire stood frozen. Her pulse quickened as the weight of her actions bore down on her. She had been the one to press the call button, the one to insist on making her discomfort known. And now, here was Marcus, being questioned and scrutinized because of her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The officer asked a few more routine questions, and Marcus answered them calmly. He knew better than to let his frustration show, though every fiber of his being wanted to demand why he was the one being questioned. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer handed back his ID. "You're free to go," he said, offering a brief nod. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Marcus nodded politely, though inside, the anger simmered. He picked up his bag and started walking toward the exit, his steps purposeful and quick. He wanted nothing more than to leave the airport and put as much distance as possible between himself and the events of the day. Claire's feet felt rooted to the ground as she watched him go. Her chest tightened, the weight of guilt pressing down hard. She glanced around, noticing the disapproving looks from a few passengers who had observed the scene. She could practically hear their silent judgment. Asterisk, "This is your fault," asterisk. She took a shaky breath, her mind racing. This wasn't how she wanted things to end. She couldn't let it end like this. Summoning what little courage she had left, Claire began to move. She wasn't sure what she would say, or if Marcus would even listen, but she knew she had to try. Marcus reached the automatic doors, the cool night air greeting him as he stepped outside. He paused for a moment, taking in a deep breath to steady himself. He wasn't sure what he had hoped for when the flight ended, but it certainly wasn't this. He felt drained, both physically and emotionally. "Wait," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Claire hurrying toward him, her expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. Marcus's brows furrowed as she approached. Of all the people he wanted to see right now, Claire wasn't one of them. He crossed his arms, his stance guarded. "What is it?" he asked, his tone cool but not unkind. Claire stopped a few feet away, her breathing uneven. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She had rehearsed what she might say in her head, but now that she was standing in front of him, everything felt inadequate. She began, her voice trembling. "I think I owe you an apology." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, letting her continue. Claire swallowed hard, her palms sweaty as she fidgeted with the strap of her handbag. I let my feelings get the best of me back there," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "And I think, no asterisk, I was wrong. About everything. I'm sorry for how I treated you." For a moment, Marcus simply stared at her, his emotions a whirlwind of disbelief and skepticism. He had heard apologies before, some genuine, others hollow. He wasn't sure where Claire's fell on that spectrum, but he could see the effort it had taken for her to say those words. Marcus's silence lingered between them, a heavy pause filled with unspoken tension. Claire shifted nervously, her apology hanging in the air like an unresolved chord. She had said the words, but now she wasn't sure if they would be enough. Marcus's face gave little away, his expression carefully measured as he considered what to say. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Apologies are easy to say," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But do you really understand why you're apologizing? Or is this just to make yourself feel better?" The question hit Claire harder than she expected. Her instinct was to bristle, to defend herself, but she stopped short. Something about the way Marcus asked it, gentle yet unyielding, made her realize this wasn't about her ego. She swallowed, searching for the right words. I think I do," she said softly, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I let my own fears and biases get in the way, and I made assumptions about you that weren't fair." Marcus nodded slightly but didn't immediately respond. He could see the effort it took for her to admit this, but part of him still held back. He had spent too many years enduring surface-level apologies, empty gestures meant to sweep away deeper issues. Before he could decide how to respond, a commotion at the nearby taxi stand caught their attention. A man, tall and visibly agitated, was arguing with one of the airport security officers. His voice carried across the parking area, loud enough to turn heads. Marcus and Claire both instinctively glanced toward the scene, and Marcus's stomach sank when he recognized the man. It was the passenger who had initially confronted Claire on the plane, the same man who had spoken up in Marcus's defense. The man's gestures were wild and erratic, his face flushed with anger as he pointed at the security officer. "I've told you already, I'm not causing trouble. I'm just waiting for my ride," he shouted, his voice rising with each word. The officer remained calm, trying to de-escalate the situation. But it was clear the man was growing increasingly agitated. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, his protective nature kicking in. He didn't know the man personally, but he felt an obligation to intervene. "That's the guy from the plane," Claire whispered, her voice tinged with both surprise and concern. She watched as Marcus approached the scene, her heart pounding with unease. "Excuse me," Marcus said, addressing the security officer. "Is everything all right here?" The officer turned, his expression briefly softening at Marcus's calm demeanor. "This gentleman has been loitering here for a while," the officer explained. "He claims he's waiting for a ride, but he's been yelling at passersby. We just want to make sure everything is under control." The man's eyes darted to Marcus, recognition flickering in his expression. "You!" he exclaimed, his tone accusatory. "You're part of this, aren't you? They're watching us. This is all connected." Marcus blinked, taken aback by the man's sudden hostility. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied evenly. "But I'm just trying to help." Claire had moved closer now, her curiosity and concern outweighing her hesitation. She stood a few steps behind Marcus, her hands clenched nervously at her sides. The man's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. "And you," he said, pointing a finger at her. "You're the one who started all of this. You think you can just sit there in judgment and walk away?" Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected to be drawn back into the conflict, and the man's accusatory tone sent a wave of guilt crashing over her. I didn't mean to," she stammered, but the man cut her off. "Didn't mean to," he repeated, his voice rising. "People like you never do. But it doesn't stop you from ruining lives." Marcus stepped between them, raising a hand to calm the man. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice steady but commanding. "This isn't the time or place for this." The man's chest heaved as he glared at Marcus, his anger barely contained, but something in Marcus's tone seemed to reach him. He took a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "None of you do." The security officer, sensing the tension easing, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, if you don't have a ride arranged, we'll have to ask you to leave the premises," he said. The man hesitated, his expression a mix of frustration and defeat. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll leave." He shot one last look at Marcus and Claire before turning and walking away, his footsteps heavy with anger and resignation. Marcus watched him go, his mind racing. The man's outburst had been unsettling, but it also hinted at something deeper, something unresolved. He couldn't help but wonder if this was just a coincidence, or if the events of the day had spiraled into something larger than he could have anticipated. Claire stood silently beside him, her hands trembling slightly. "That was intense," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his gaze still fixed on the direction the man had gone. "Yeah," he said quietly, "and I have a feeling it's not over yet." Marcus stood in the cool night air, his mind swirling with the events that had just unfolded. The encounter with the man from the plane lingered uneasily in his thoughts. Something about the man's words, his intensity, struck a chord Marcus couldn't shake. Claire stood beside him, her face pale and her expression distant. She looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. The tension between them was palpable, layered with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "I think I'll grab a cab and head to my hotel," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "It's been a long day." Claire hesitated, taking a small step toward him. Wait, she said, her voice soft but urgent. I know I made a mess of things, but can we talk? Really talk? Marcus paused, his eyes scanning hers for sincerity. He saw it there, a genuine desire to make amends, to understand. Against his better judgment, he nodded. All right, he said. But not here. Let's find somewhere quieter. The two of them walked to a nearby coffee shop, its warm lights spilling out onto the dark sidewalk. They found a table in the corner, away from the bustle of the other patrons. For a while, neither of them spoke. Claire stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, while Marcus sat back, his arms crossed, waiting for her to begin. I've been thinking about what you said, Claire finally started, her voice tentative. About whether I understand why I'm apologizing. And the truth is, I don't think I fully did. Not until tonight. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting her continue. When I saw that man yelling at the security officer, she went on, it reminded me of how quickly things can escalate. How easily fear and anger can take over. And I realized that's what happened to me on the plane. I let my fear dictate my actions, and I didn't stop to think about how they would affect you. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. Fear can make people do terrible things, he said. But recognizing it is only the first step. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know, she admitted. But I want to change. I need to. Before Marcus could respond, the door of the coffee shop swung open, and the man from the airport stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room quickly before landing on Marcus and Claire. Marcus tensed immediately, his body instinctively preparing for another confrontation, but the man's demeanor was different this time. He looked calmer, almost remorseful. I need to talk to you, the man said, approaching their table. His voice was steady but carried an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Marcus exchanged a wary glance with Claire before nodding. All right, he said. What's on your mind? The man sat down across from them, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world rested on them. I owe you an explanation, he began, and probably an apology too. Marcus frowned, his curiosity piqued. An explanation for what? The man hesitated, rubbing his hands together nervously. For what happened at the airport and on the plane, he said. You see, I wasn't just defending you back there. I was trying to distract from something else. Claire's eyes widened, and Marcus's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Marcus asked cautiously. The man took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. I was being followed, he admitted. By people I owe money to. Dangerous people. I thought if I caused a scene, they'd back off, maybe lose track of me. But instead, it just made everything worse. Marcus sat back stunned. So all of this, everything that happened, it wasn't just about us, he asked. The man shook his head. No, he said quietly. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I used you as a shield, and that wasn't fair. Claire stared at him, her mind racing. So, when you said we were being watched, she began, you weren't just being paranoid. The man gave a bitter laugh. No, he said. I wasn't. And I think they're still out there. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. He glanced around the coffee shop, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. He didn't see anyone suspicious, but the man's fear was contagious. What are you planning to do? Marcus asked, his voice low. I don't know, the man admitted. I thought about running, but they'll find me eventually. They always do. Claire looked at Marcus, her face pale. What should we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to get involved in something so dangerous, but his conscience wouldn't let him walk away either. First, we need to figure out if they're really following you, he said. Then we can decide on the next step. The three of them left the coffee shop together, their nerves on edge as they stepped back into the night. The street was quiet, but Marcus's sharp eyes caught movement in the shadows. A man in a dark coat was standing across the street, his posture tense and his gaze fixed on them. They're here, the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus's heart raced as he turned to Claire. Stay close to me, he said firmly. We're not out of this yet.